is something which is based on the moral evil, or natural evil is extenuating to the point where evil itself is judgment upon itself. It's imploding on itself for the very purpose that in seeing evil, in suffering evil, it turns our hearts into a heavenly perspective, put it that way, that we should seek to be saved from this world. So that evil in that respect is not a hindrance, but actually a benefit to coming to know God.
Well, again, I want to thank everybody as well for showing up, and thanks for the opportunity, and thanks to Jordan and Shandon as well. What they presented is a number of things that philosophers call theodicies, which are attempts to make sense of suffering in the world. And these are classic responses, and I think in many ways they're somewhat compelling. One thing that's going to happen tonight is I think you're going to see a certain sort of argument structure be presented. Philosophers like to refer to it as an inference to the best explanation kind of argument. And basically what happens here is there's some phenomenon or there's something out there in the world that suggested, calls out for an explanation. And there are two competing hypotheses on the stage tonight. There's a theistic hypothesis and there's an atheistic hypothesis. And we're going to disagree about which hypothesis does a better job of explaining a variety of different sorts of things. And I think that's a perfectly legitimate argument strategy. Science often operates in that way, and that's the way a lot of philosophical disputes are resolved as well. Now, in this particular case, it's the atheist who's claiming that there's something out there in the world which is a bit of an embarrassment for the theist. It's something that you would not expect to find if theism is correct, especially a Christian version of theism. Quite often God is described as something like a father figure. He cares about us, he loves us. When good things happen, it's suggested that he had a hand in that, he brought that about. And so the amount of what appears to be just completely unnecessary suffering that exists in the world, really pointless suffering and horrendous suffering as well. When you think of God as being a caring father type figure, when you think of that conception of how the world works, it just doesn't make sense. It just doesn't, it's not what you would expect to find. And so instead, on the other hand, if you believe that there is nobody sort of looking out for us, if you sort of buy into an atheistic conception of the world, as a matter of fact, that is, you would expect sometimes, sad as it is, that that's how the world would work occasionally. Suffering would exist. It wouldn't be serving any kind of higher purpose. There wouldn't be any meaning to it. It just happens. Now, there's a variety of things we can say in response to the different sorts of theodicies that are brought up here. I might just touch on one and then maybe Mike can say something as well. It's often suggested that the amount of suffering that exists is in part due to moral evil. It's in part due to our activities. And there's a famous theodicy that they didn't explicitly mention, but I suspect it's sort of looming in the background. It's called the free will defense. And it suggests that the reason why there's really suffering in the world is because it comes hand in hand with some greater good, namely God giving us free will. And many of you may have heard something along these lines before as well. And I think that's actually probably the most compelling and most plausible kind of theodicy. It does have some problems, however, and just one I'll just touch on is it is true that we think of freedom as being a very important, very noble, very good thing, but oftentimes we don't think it's such a good thing that it's worth the suffering that we may know comes along with it. Remember that God is omniscient, so he knows in advance everything that a Hitler's going to do and an Osama bin Laden's going to do. And I think the point that many of us would make is that given that he knows that he's going to do it, in that case it would be perfectly appropriate, and in fact you would think almost obligatory, for God to take away their freedom. And here's an analogy to think of along those lines. Imagine a defense attorney defending a terrorist in the following way. Imagine a defense attorney says, yes, I know my client is going to commit some atrocity if we let him go. He's going to try to, in fact, blow up a city. But you have to let him go. This is his argument to the jury. You have to let him go. Because if you imprison him, you're going to take away his freedom. And his freedom's a very, very important thing. So you don't want to restrain his or restrict his freedom in any way, so you need to let him go, even though that goes hand in hand with knowing that he's going to commit these atrocities. Now, I think most of us would say you should fire that defense attorney. That's a lousy argument. But that seems to be the argument that's quite often given in the form of a free will defense with regard to why God allows suffering. I'll just stop there.
Okay.
Be brief so we can give them a chance to respond.
Okay, yeah, I'll be brief. Professor Ramsey kind of touched on, a response to a theodicy that they might bring up still, the free will defense, but what they did make clear seems to be focusing on something called the soul-making theodicy, which basically describes, you know, our purpose in life here. They talked about if we're not God's pets, we're here on a journey, so to speak, and suffering is necessary to get us from one point to another. The analogy sometimes is used, you know, what would be better, just automatically having, you know, a perfect body, or be exercising every day leading up to it, and the journey you go on to good health. That's, and the process is more important. The response I'd like to make is this, you know, first, a couple things. First of all, I don't see how suffering is what really it needs to be used to get us closer to God. If God does exist, I think a great way to, one thing that would, I have a list of a ton of things that would make me believe in God. It grows like every day when I think of something new. One of the things is if all suffering was alleviated. If all suffering in the world was alleviated, I would believe in God instantly. It would make obvious sense, you know, that a God must exist because he doesn't allow suffering to exist, and that would be a great thing for God to do. Another point is that, you know, as much as, yeah, suffering does maybe drive people to God, it probably drives just as many people away from God. Many people, when they're faced with horrible circumstances and they see good things happen to bad people, bad things happen to good people, they leave God. They realize there can't be a God. God wouldn't allow this. And there's also another response is there's many instances of suffering that is not known by anybody. For example, I actually made this point, a fawn who gets burned alive in a forest fire and lays on the forest floor and dies after days of suffering. Likely that kind of thing goes on. What are we learning from that? What are we getting out of that? No, there's no good to be had, no journey there. So there's unknown suffering that's not doing any good. So that's a couple responses to the soul-making theodicy they offer.
All right, let me see if I can just mention a couple of things that Bill brought up. First of all, that evil is embarrassing. I think that there's a sense in which that's true. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a problem of evil. But like I said, that's more of a psychological issue. We feel the force of the fact that evil exists, and I think that is undeniable. Now, with respect to that we would fire the trial attorney who brought this into court to say, look, you can't justify criminal behavior on the threat of that whatever this person did may lead to something better. But I'm not arguing that tonight. I'm not arguing that the problem of evil is somehow sort of applied ethics scenario. I'm just simply saying that it is God's prerogative that if he so chooses to construct a world where he allows the natural laws to take their course and he allows people to do certain things in order to maximize the amount of people who may come to him, then I think it's perfectly acceptable for God to permit that. Now, let me also mention, too, that there have been specific scenarios. Again, I'm not just saying that, but specific scenarios like the famous Man Gulch tragedy of the 1940s, 1950s, in which, you know, some awkward behavior by some smoke jumpers was committed. They lit fire and said, hey, let's jump onto the fire, this brush area of fire, let's jump on it to avert the fire that's heading our way rapidly. And the people that were with them basically said, no, we're not doing that. They didn't realize that the purpose for that was good. It was going to protect them. I don't want to maximize the time, but I know Jordan's going to step in here, so I'll release it to you.
Okay, in response to Michael, we are not saying suffering is necessary. And all good, all loving, all powerful God in that respect